Shayla, I think I might get started just with like some introductory stuff while people are trickling in, just because there's quite a bit I'm hoping to cover tonight. And I want to try to keep things to the time limit. So what do you think about that?
Sounds great, Jessica.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Just so you know, as you probably got the notification as you came in, that this session is being recorded. We will shut off the recording at the end when we open up the question period. And so as we go along tonight, feel free to add questions to the chat. I think tonight, because I'm trying to share a lot of information, maybe if something comes up that's like a clarification or, a question on the subject matter, just pop it right into the chat, and then we'll go through them with Shayla helping with moderation at the end of the session. And then, so I'm hoping to, have some time at the end where we can ask questions and have any discussion if anyone wants to share their own tips on some tips for gardening in the fall. But so I think I'm going to get started. My name is Jessica Gale. I've been working as the garden consultant with Green Venture this summer. I have about 10 years of gardening and farming experience, 7 of which I ran my own small farm business, which is this opening picture is one of the photos from that farm. And so, I'm going to get right into it. We're going to just plunge right in. So at the beginning of each session, with Green Venture and myself, when I'm teaching, we always like to do a land acknowledgement, remembering the First Nations people that stewarded the land that we were currently on in Hamilton. So, remembering that the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people this is their traditional lands, and that we're very close to the Six Nations Reserve. And I put this photo up of potatoes because one of the things that I think I'm always taking time to reflect on as a settler woman is all of the amazing food crops that are the product of the genius of First Nations and Indigenous people in North and South America. And so, and then also by reflecting on this land and reflecting on my own heritage, I think about, I come from some Irish ancestry, and thinking about how this crop that was, bred in South America went all the way over to my ancestors and then is coming back to me growing it to this day. And so, I take every day that I work on the land as an opportunity to remember that work, and remember that work was brutally cut off by colonization, and that there's much work for us to do as settler and immigrant people to this country. In this workshop today, I'm going to cover a few different things. Last call, what you can still sow, what you can sow and plant for 2022, some fall ecological garden care things to consider, and looking forward, some planning tips for this fall to think about what your garden can look like in 2022. And so, I think a lot of times with so much focus on spring and early summer, we can forget that there's still so much that we can grow. If you use social media, I highly recommend these wonderful seed keepers seed company out of New York called Fruition Seeds, and they do these wonderful updates every couple of weeks, letting you know what you can sow, what's the last chance. And so I will acknowledge I borrowed this from them and my own experiences, and kind of adapted it for Hamilton. And so in early September, we can still be sowing greens. It's a great time to grow things like arugula and lettuce, all those crops that would have struggled in your veggie garden in the high heat of summer. We're finally getting those cooler temperatures so they can thrive now. It's also a good time to do some quicker root crops like radishes and turnips, maybe even some baby beets and some herbs. If you have been growing transplants, or you can get them from like a local nursery, you can still pop into the ground things like collards and kales and chard, and that, you know, those can still do well, especially with some protection. And so, one second, I'm just going to do one quick thing. Okay, there we go. But sadly, by this time in early September, I wouldn't recommend as much sowing carrots. Trying to get bigger beets or watermelon radish, we're kind of gone too far for that. And so mid to late September, it's about the same, with a caveat. The only thing I would say is at this, mid to late September, you're not going to want to bother with dill, definitely not those beets and carrots and so forth. And so one of the ways that you can go about achieving that longer crop season in your veggie garden is by using season extension. So there's a number of techniques and materials that you can use that can protect these more cold hardy crops into the fall. So you can be harvesting, I've definitely harvested stuff into December at times, definitely end of November, by using things like in the top left-hand corner is something called row cover. It's kind of this woven fabric material that actually helps insulate the crops. And you can, gently drape them over the crops, although I would, more recommend that you put some sort of hoops up. These things you can purchase, but you can also kind of do your own. So for instance, you can bend your own hoops. You can, there's all sorts of DIY hacks for this online. The main thing is that when you have these sort of season extension items, is trying not to let these materials rest on the crops, because if you do get frost, it creates like a contact point where it can, the frost can damage the plant. And you'd be surprised, like they really can make a difference. Two other things you can consider is doing something like a cold frame, like we see here in the upper right-hand corner. This one's like a super simple one, just using some wood, and it looks like plastic. But, you can go all out and build it with glass. I've seen people use recycled window panes. And so what's great is you can really grow things potentially, depending how mild our winters are, you can grow it quite far into winter with this kind of style. And then this is something we don't really talk about as much in North America, but it's more common, I would say, in like the UK, is using things like cloches. But I think, like, I looked at this photo and I was like, that just looks like you could reuse like a salad container or something like that. And so basically it just ends up being a teeny tiny greenhouse for your plants. Now, the important thing to realize, if you're going to do season extension, especially if you're going to use some sort of covering that is a plastic material, it is still possible for the crops to get too hot, especially if it's a really sunny day. It can get really roasty toasty in there. So, what I would recommend, cover things up at night, but during the day, leave it open, have some good air ventilation through there, because you might end up with some mold and mildew issues if there's not good airflow. But these are great ways to, on a garden scale, that you can be eating fresh produce from your garden way into fall and winter. Okay, so one thing I would like to encourage all of you to do is to consider planting some native plants from seed. And I know, like, I myself, I will admit, I'm very new to doing this. And I was like a little overwhelmed because you start reading about native seed and you're like, oh, like there's all these requirements of like cold stratification and the amount of time and yada yada. There's a very simple method to it, and I'm going to share that with you in just a minute. But why do we want to grow native plants? If you're not familiar with what native plant means, it's a plant that has evolved to the specific conditions of its place. So, here in Ontario, we have so many different native plants that are for all the different unique environments that we have here. And what's really important about that is then they're the foundation of our ecosystems, where there's all of these insects, birds, animals that are connected to those plants and use them for food and habitat, nesting materials, and so forth. So it's really important that we try to have some of these plants in our landscapes to support that whole food chain in our ecosystem. And another reason why it's really great to grow these native plants from seed is it's affordable. I grew probably hundreds of native plants from seed this past winter into spring. I kid you not, I probably saved $1,000 worth of seedlings, just because I ended up with so many, and I basically filled out my whole garden, partly with the seedlings that I grew. So these wonderful images and this very simple technique was taught to me by this group from Maine called the Wild Seed Project, which they're devoted to collecting and sharing and educating around native seeds and native plants of the state of Maine. And so a very simple way of doing this, and actually, before I get into the how, I think it's really important to talk about what is cold stratification. So when you start getting into growing things that are not just annual plants, you start reading about cold stratification sometimes. And so cold stratification means that, let's take an example of, say, columbine seeds. So a columbine plant, like we see here in this center image, it's going to bloom in the spring, early summer. It's going to start forming its seed pods, and starting in late summer into fall, you're going to have all that seed in those pods, and it's going to drop to the ground. And some native plants will actually start germinating right away, and the little seedlings will survive winter in a very small sort of state. But a lot of native seeds, need to pass through a cold period of our winter in order to germinate. And so what we're trying to do is kind of mimic that cycle. And it's important for these plants to go through that cycle if that's required for them, because a lot of times having that cold period, especially if it's the seeds experience like some cold and then some warm up, some cold and some warm up, it actually helps mechanically break down their seed coats. And sometimes there's also like biological and chemical reactions that are happening in the seed that they need those cold temperatures in order to trigger germination. And so before I get into germination codes, let's just talk about how we can do this. Very, very simple. So you can, let's see. So let's first talk about where you can get seed from. And this is something I apologize I didn't include it in the slide, but Green Venture is offering a native seed swap this fall, which I'll talk about at the end of the workshop. The North American Native Plant Society has seed available, especially if you become a member. It's a super affordable way to get all sorts of seed. The I've gotten seed before from the Wildflower Farm up in Coldwater, Ontario. And you can also collect your own. That takes a little bit more planning, plant ID skills, kind of figuring out when's the right time to collect that seed. But there's tons of very simple things you can start with, which I'll talk about a little further on. But once you get that seed and you have looked up what the germination codes are, you're going to just take that seed. The first very important thing you're going to do is you're going to put some labels, because these pots are actually going to live outdoors. And so it's really important that you write down, maybe even in a couple places, what the seeds are, because unless you have really stellar seedling identification skills, you will not remember come spring what's germinating, what's not. So first of all, you're going to want to label. Second of all, you're going to just gently sprinkle over the surface of the soil the seed that you've gotten. And then one of the tips I really liked from the Wild Seed Project is you're going to take some sand, and then you're going to spread that over, depending on how thick. Some seeds like to live more on the surface of the soil. Some like to be buried a little bit more. And so how much sand you put down, how deep you put the seed in, depends on the requirements of the seed, which usually you can find along with the germination code information, either on the seed packets themselves or using references online. And so what's really great about using the sand is that the sand kind of helps hold the soil in place, because these pots, as you can see in this last image, they're going to live outside. So you're going to find a place in your yard that's relatively protected. You want some place where they're going to get some rain, they're going to get some snow on them, but they're not going to experience, like, don't put it near your downspout, that sort of thing. And you're going to let them just kind of live out their lives, dreaming their plant dreams through the winter months, and they'll start germinating all on their own come spring, because you've allowed them to go through that cold stratification period. And so one other important tip with this, of course, the raccoons and squirrels just love to dig in fresh sown pots like this. So consider, putting down some chicken wire, make sure it's, nice and secured. And it works amazing. Like I tried it for the first time this past year. I was actually a little late to the game, so I didn't put my pots outside until about February. And I would say that the plants that I did outdoors germinated just as well, if not better, than the ones that I did artificially indoors. And so I think the last thing that I'll talk about, and this ties into germination codes, is that if you start looking at native seeds, you'll notice that there's different codes, A, B, C, D, H, on and on, associated with that seed. And that's what's used by the nursery industry after experimentation for how to wake that seed up, but not go through this letting the pots be outside kind of process. So, if you're running a native plant nursery, you want to speed up that process. So, for instance, you might have a code that says 30 days cold stratification. So you can take that seed, put it in a lightly damp paper towel in a plastic bag, put it in your fridge for 30 days, take it out, sow it, put it under lights, and it'll germinate. And so basically, I just recommend, I really like the US nursery Prairie Moon as a resource to look at germination codes. But I think in the end, like, especially if you're just starting out, just do the first technique. It's so simple. You can literally do all this and kind of just leave them and kind of forget about them versus, when you start getting into artificial cold stratification inside of your fridge, you can't forget those seeds in the fridge. Like, you have to check on them. You have to write it down in your calendar. Sometimes they'll go off or sometimes they'll dry out. And so this is such a beautiful, simple, like, solution that mimics what the seeds are doing in nature anyways. So I highly recommend this as a system. And let's move along. So, and I'm just occasionally looking down to refer to my notes to keep me on track here. So, what, again, not a lot of people necessarily think about is that fall can be a really great time for planting. And so why would we plant in fall? Fall can be more mild, like, especially in Ontario, we have such a quick speed up to summer. We can go from having snow to 2 weeks later having 30 degrees. And that's incredibly stressful on little baby plants. And so fall can be a really great time to plant because, it's a bit more of a slow kind of easing of the season. There's also more consistent rain typically in the fall. So spend less time watering. I also find that, in the spring, I'm just like trying to do 20 million things at once. Fall, like, I could focus more on, a few plants with less going on. And sometimes you can get really good deals at nurseries this time of year. I was working with some volunteers today that were saying that, a local nursery that they work with was having tremendous sales this time of year. So some things to consider, though, before you dive in and purchase some plants. You want to think about how hot and dry has it been this fall. This is becoming more and more of an issue, sadly. I feel like this year has been pretty solid. Like, I feel confident putting some new plants in the ground this fall, but there is times where we end up in September and we're in a state of drought. So, proceed cautiously. How much time do you have to get it all done? Because in the end, unlike the spring, where there's a little bit of wiggle room, you can still plant into summer. It's not the best, but things will survive. There's a hard, fast end to our falls, which is frost. So, make sure you have enough time to do a project like this. Also consider how exposed is your yard. You're putting in plants that might be a little bit more tender, which could make them more exposed to winter weather. Oh, and are you feeling particular? Sometimes nurseries this time of year don't have the best variety or selection. And so, because they've been selling and selling all year. So, there's great opportunities for sales, but maybe it's not exactly what you want. And just really make sure that you're inspecting plants very closely, because sometimes nursery plants can be kind of worse for wear this time of year. Okay, so, and some last things to consider is what zone you're in, what growing zone. So you need to know, especially, like, I'm assuming a lot of folks on this video are coming in from Hamilton, but so we have, pretty good latitude of oh, sorry about that. I don't know how I got muted. So I was just saying, if you're on this, looking at this workshop, just remember, like, we're here in Hamilton, it might be a different growing zone than where you're from. So just know when that frost date is for you. What's your microclimate like? Again, how exposed is your yard? And how hardy is the plant that you're planting? Like, maybe fall planting isn't the best time for, something that's going to be a little bit more tender and finicky. Something also that I came across while preparing for this presentation is that fall is a better time to be planting deciduous. Trees and shrubs that lose their leaves, better to plant deciduous plants than to plant evergreens, which can actually dry out more in the winter. And also to focus on planting plants that have more shallow fibrous roots versus plants that have really deep tap roots. Okay, so these are planting deadlines, and like that makes it seem so hard and fast. You know, again, you need to kind of run these through your own parameters of your own yard and your own situation. But I would say early September is still a great time to plant perennials. One thing that I should mention is that another reason why it's good to plant in fall is that a lot of times plants will focus right away on establishing roots, and they're not focused as much on growing out vegetation. So in the spring, they're trying to do both at once, and it can be very stressful to them. So what's nice is if you're putting something in the ground in fall, it's really going to focus its energy on getting that root established. And that's the, where all of the energy is stored in the plant in the winter months. And so it's still a great time to plant perennials. You want to make sure if you're doing like a warm season grass or a fern, which you can simply find out whether it's a warm season or a cool season grass by just doing some Googling, looking up the genus and the species and potentially the variety. You want that soil to be fairly warm if you're planting warm season grasses. And if you're planting a cool season grass, you actually want the soil to be cooler. And what's great also about planting in the fall is that soil heat, the heat in the earth that has been kind of building over the course of the summer, that will actually, the heat in the soil will be retained for longer than you would think. So a lot of times we don't get really hard freezes where the soil itself is freezing. I feel like definitely into November and December, sometimes even later these days. So, and then lastly, shrubs and trees. October is actually a really ideal time to do it, again, because they can get very, very stressed during spring plantings. So if you actually look around, there's a lot of tree planting that happens, with not-for-profits and the botanical gardens, that sort of thing. A lot of that happens in October. Okay. So, and I always like to talk about this whenever we talk about planting shrubs and trees, because this is such a pet peeve of mine. So I literally searched for probably like a half an hour to find the perfect planting diagrams. I should have just drawn it myself, to be honest, that are good, like the good method of planting a tree or a shrub, because there's a lot of mistakes that are made that can have long-term consequences for the health of the tree or shrub. And so, the diagram we're looking at on the left is if you're purchasing something that was either in a pot or, balled and burlapped. And then the tree or the shrub on the right is a bare root tree that you can often purchase in the fall. And so the really key thing I wanted to point out is looking at where the mulch is and looking at where the root flare is on the plant, and making sure that the root flare of the tree, so where the tree kind of goes, does that really graceful arc, that is never ever buried. That has to be exposed. And the second thing that's very, very important is that that is never covered with mulch. Basically, by covering that, you're just really inviting in pests, disease in the long term. But it's still so common to see, I call them mulch volcanoes, like just so much mulch piled up or things planted too deep. And so better that you have that root ball right at the surface of the soil than to have it be buried too deep. And I think maybe just one quick or two quick things I'll point out in this really nice bare root drawing from Lush Gardens is that first and really important thing, if you ever get a bare root tree, is that you're going to want to plant that right away. You don't want it to get really warm. You certainly don't want it to get dried out. Always keep the plastic bag with moisture in it around it until you're ready to plant it. And then before you go to plant it, you actually want to soak the roots for 4 to 6 hours before you put them in the ground. And I thought this diagram was very well done. You know, they made a little bit of a mound so you could put the roots kind of nicely draped out. And then you're going to fill that in, again, not burying the root flare. I would say, you know, so those are the good rules of thumb when it comes to all trees and most shrubs. I would say the one thing about perennials is that you don't have to worry quite so much about that root ball being buried. I like to actually make sure there's soil on top of the root ball of a perennial just to make sure it won't dry out easily. But, you know, all plants need different things. Okay, so I'm gonna keep speeding along here just so we can leave some time at the end for questions. So fall is often time we think of cleaning up the garden. And I really want to encourage you this year to do that cleanup, but not too much. I think we go a little bit too far, and I'm going to share with you the reasons why we want to leave some of that plant material out. And I put this photo up. It was from an article in the New York Times with this wonderful designer I encourage you all to check out, named Pete Oldoff, very, very famous garden designer, world renowned, did like the High Line, Millennium Park, all these amazing gardens. And I think what is just amazing is that the way he designs his gardens is that they look just as interesting and beautiful in winter as they do any other time of the year. And so, you know, there's a number of ecological reasons why we want to leave things more in place, but there's also like aesthetic reasons, you know, like having some winter interest, and it doesn't have to be just evergreen shrubs and trees. And so actually, let me go back. So when you're doing your cleanup, focus on, you know, did you have plants that had major disease or pest issues, especially anything that was annual, especially if it's, you know, something like a blighted tomato, you do want to take that out because you don't want to keep those spores there in the garden to potentially get into the soil. And so, you know, just remembering that if you're pulling out things that have pretty strong diseases like that, weeds that have seed heads, you want to avoid putting those in your own backyard compost. Backyard composting systems simply don't get hot enough in their biological processes to break down the diseases, often fungi that causes those diseases, or to sterilize weed seed. So better to put that in a municipal system. They heat the piles hot enough that it can deal with it, or put it, if you live rurally, in a burn pile. And so why we want to leave some of this material up from an ecological perspective is that a lot of times there's a number of good beneficial insects that use these stems as a place to overwinter in as adults or as eggs. Also, like, there's a number of wonderful plants that offer seeds that are, the food that our native birds that stay here over winter use for food in the winter. And so the other thing I just want to challenge you all, please, 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 to consider is leaving your leaves. So I understand it, like if you have a yard that has a ton of trees, you're going to want to do some raking, maybe leave it, trying to rake some of the leaves off of your lawn, but really consider leaving those leaves in your garden beds. You're going to want to do this for a couple of reasons. First, it benefits your plants. This is your free blanket, your free winter blanket for your plants to help protect them through the winter months. So, especially with the types of winters that we're now having where we don't have that snow cover, which is a positive thing. That's an insulating, beautiful cover of snow that helps protect plants. But often we're not getting the same snowfall that we used to. And so those leaves are really essential in insulating plants, not only from the cold, but also from like the dry cold, which can really damage perennials and shrubs and things like that over the winter months. So that's, the garden side of things. The ecological side of things is leaf litter is the home. It's a home for these amazing insects. Often there's so many butterflies and moths that either overwinter as caterpillars. We all love the little woolly bears. They're in that leaf litter. This beautiful Luna moth, they're using that leaf litter. And so, they're overwintering as adults, as eggs or caterpillars, and that's what they need in order to survive the winter. So please consider leaving it for them and for your plants. And so, and another really important point with that is if, and hopefully you do, leave those leaves on. One thing, there's all these articles this spring that I noticed were cropping up is everyone was like so keen, with the pandemic to spruce up their yard starting in March. And they were pulling all the leaves off of their yards really, really early, even the folks that were good to leave them. And the problem is that a lot of those insects actually won't start emerging until we have consistent, I believe, overnight temperatures of 10 degrees Celsius. And so if you remove them before we start having those consistent temperatures, you again are moving all of those critters out of their habitat. So consider leaving them on until it gets a little bit warmer. And when it does, I would really love to share this process of making leaf mold. So leaf mold is something you hear more about. It's very common, like, to talk about it in the UK, less so here. I would love to see so many gardeners here in Hamilton trying this out. We made some containers to try it out this fall at Eco House with Green Venture. And so basically it's creating a compost kind of mulch simply out of leaves, putting the leaves into a container, allowing them to break down over the course of an entire year. And you end up with this really lovely, like rich material, just like if you go into a forest and you're kind of walking around and you kind of push back some of the surface, you notice this beautiful crumbly kind of texture on top of the soil. And that's leaf mold. And leaf mold in the UK, people are starting to create it as an alternative to peat in a potting mix. And in case you don't know, peat is a wonderful material. It's very versatile. It does a good job. However, it is something more abundant here in Canada, but we would consider it a non-renewable resource. And that's because it's a type of moss that comes out of bogs, often in the north, and it takes so long to form. It's pretty much a non-renewable resource. And so I think that we could all, if we're, taking our leaves off in the spring after the insects have done their thing, putting them in these containers, breaking it down, we could be creating this wonderful free resource to be using as a mulch on our gardens, in our potting mix. Yeah, it's a great material to try out. So we're going to try it at Green Venture. We'll let you know how it goes. And maybe two final tips with the leaf mold is in the spring, if you are shredding those leaves a little bit more, running them through a chipper or doing it by hand or chopping them, or I've seen folks just run over it with a lawnmower a few times. That will help the decomposition happen quicker. And the thing to remember is that this is not like your garden compost. It's not as much about the nutritional value of it. It's more kind of the texture and the crumbliness that it adds to the soil. Okay. So I feel like, sorry. I knew it. I missed a slide. Okay, so another fall task that you could be doing this year that I recommend is the fall is a great time to try out sheet mulching. So this image from Hobby Farms shows two different techniques you can use. And so basically we do this in order to create new garden beds, especially if you have a turf area. And what's really great about this, it's a no-till method to create that bed. It's really like the least work-intensive way to do it, but it takes time. And so that's why the fall is like the perfect time to do it, because you have the full winter and into early spring for all these materials to break down. So often when I'm doing like a sheet mulch, sometimes you also hear it referred to as like lasagna gardening, which is basically sheet mulching, but with multiple layers. You're taking cardboard or newspaper, non-glossy paper, laying it down, wetting it down, and then putting some sort of either a compost on top, a compost in like a straw, or you could use leaves, but making sure it's nicely covered, and you're just leaving it. And so basically over time, those materials break down. So eventually you're just planting into beautiful new soil. And often this is being broken down by earthworms and just bacterial action. And so the reason we're doing this, again, it's like such a labor saver. When we use things like tillers, you're inverting the soil, which is messing up the soil structure. It's damaging things like the mycorrhizae fungi that are growing in soil. It's also bringing to the surface potential weed seed. And I've done this in my house, and I've done it in a few different places through the years. And I am amazed at how few weeds and grass end up coming through. Like, you still need to do a little bit of weeding, but compared to trying to till it and then plant a new garden in it, night and day. So fall is a really great time for sheet mulching. Mulching is also a good practice to do in general in your garden in fall. So this picture here is illustrating, some garlic that, is in the spring, but was mulched in the fall as an insulation barrier. The main thing you want to focus on, though, is to try to do stuff that's mulching that with materials that isn't high in nutrients, because you don't really want to be encouraging plants to be like growing like crazy in the fall. You want them to kind of be settling down and getting ready for winter. Okay, so I'm going to start pretty much wrapping up here with a few last slides. So fall is a really great time to try your hand at seed saving. I could talk all day about seed saving, but I'll just mention a few that would be really simple to try your hands at. Beans, peas, tomatoes, peppers, calendula, cosmos, nasturtiums, common things you find in your garden. This is the time of year to start collecting that seed. They're relatively easy to clean. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some native plants that are really easy to collect and available this time of year, things like milkweed, black-eyed Susans. I love my mountain mint and Leonarda, coreopsis, asters, and so forth. They're a little bit trickier to clean, but it's less important compared to your veggie seed to have it perfectly clean. Other fall tasks, starting in late October into early November, which it used to be even earlier than that, but that's the time of year we're now kind of doing these things. It's ideal for planting garlic in spring bulbs like tulips, daffodils, crocus, other narcissus, that sort of thing. I kind of carefully tried to choose these photographs where it's very important when planting any sort of bulb like this that you have the pointy end up, because that's where the new shoot is going to grow up in the spring and the roots are going to go in the bottom of the plant. And then another thing to just mention is that if you have non-hardy annuals growing, like your zinnias, your marigolds, all your bedding plants, if you continue to deadhead them, removing the spent flowers, they will continue to flower until frost. So taking that little bit of extra effort to, do that tedious plucking will guarantee you more color right up until frost. And then lastly, getting into planning, that fall is the best time to take notes. And it's just like a lot of times you don't feel like you have the energy to do it, but man, you will thank yourself. You'll say, thank you, fall self, for taking the time to do this when you're in February and you're like trying to plan your garden. And you're like, oh shoot, what was that tomato variety that I really, really liked? You won't remember. So you take notes. This time of year, I take notes on where I want to move things. I'm often experimenting with putting plants in different places, what you want to grow more of, less of, what were your favorite varieties. You're like, oh, I got to grow more of that next year. Areas that you had disease and pest issues, so huge. Like if you had like a major outbreak of something in one part of your garden, don't plant the same thing there next year. Move it to a new location. I found using my smartphone is just like such a great tool for this. I don't know how I didn't know this, but I started using the notes function on my iPhone where it allows you to take a photo that inserts it into the note, and then I can type out some notes. And so basically I've been going around to all the gardens I work on, taking photos, taking videos, and then writing the notes underneath. Also, sometimes I will walk around a garden and just talk out loud and take a video. And that has been incredibly helpful also. If you don't have a map of your garden, consider doing it. This is really important when you want to do things like crop rotation. So making sure that you aren't planting the same family of plants in the same place every single year, which can end up, building up disease and pest issues over time. It's also really important because like I do this all the time. I pop things in the ground. I'm like, oh, I'll remember. And then in the spring, I'm like, oh, who are you? You look familiar, but I just can't remember who you are. And so that's something really, helpful so you don't accidentally weed it out, or, when you're trying to plant new things, it doesn't mess up your design. And then, like I will fully admit I don't do as much reading in the summer months as I should about the garden, but the winter is the perfect time for that. But sometimes I can't always remember, like, oh, what was that thing I wanted to look up? Or what was that book that I saw at the RBG that I really wanted to try out? So making yourself a reading list, or maybe writing down some workshops you'd like to take in the winter months. Ooh. So that kind of concludes the workshop for now. I'm going to just very quickly talk about the fall plant sale and share that we are launching tomorrow with Green Venture, that you can order online. All native plants that were grown at Eco House by myself and some of the other staff. We have a full list online. And then I thought this was a very sweet program that we started, is to be a pollinator pal. So you can purchase native plants to grow in your own backyard. You can share your native plants. So for instance, you could swap plants with us. If you've been growing a ton of one thing, we could swap it for something else, making it a barter kind of transaction. And then we also have a number of wonderful native seeds that we've collected that we would love to share with you. And then particularly if you want to share or next share when things are done seeding. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'm a little close to time, but I'm happy to continue going over. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up to questions. I see there's a number of things in the chat. So